It is Christmas Eve in Portsmouth, a town where the heartbeat of the British Empire could be heard in the crash of the sea against the docks and the clamor of sailors returning from voyages. The air was thick with the smell of roasted chestnuts sold by street vendors, the glow of lanterns on frosted windows, and the faint sound of church bells carrying through the night. Families gathered around hearths, children clutched new toys carved from wood, and carolers moved door to door, their voices lifting into the frozen air. To most, it was a night of warmth, charity, and celebration. But beneath this facade of merriment, something far darker stirred. Portsmouth was a town of power, pride, and secrecy, and on this night, one house would conceal a horror that even time itself would struggle to erase. Inside the townhouse of Clara Booth, preparations had been underway for weeks. The widow's servants rushed through candlelit corridors, balancing silver platters of roasted goose, glazed hams, sugared almonds, and steaming tureens of broth. In the kitchen, the scent of cloves and cinnamon filled the air as great pots of mulled wine simmered gently, the steam curling upward in sweet, spiced clouds. The table in the dining hall was laid with precision, polished goblets reflecting the firelight, fine linens embroidered with holly leaves, and garlands of evergreen hanging along the walls. At the head of the table stood Clara herself, a woman who had mastered the art of performance. Her gown of deep velvet shimmered as she moved, her lace cuffs brushing against the polished wood. She was the image of refinement, the portrait of generosity. To every eye, Clara Booth was a gracious hostess, offering comfort and companionship in a season that could be painfully lonely. But Clara was more than a hostess. To the men she had invited, she was a figure of allure, of mystery, and perhaps of temptation. Her guest list was not filled with mere merchants or middling officers, but with admirals, commanders of fleets, veterans of battles fought on seas far from England's shores. These men had braved cannon fire, tempests, and endless months of hunger at sea. Yet tonight they stepped eagerly into Clara Booth's dining hall, thinking only of warmth, wine, and laughter. The widow had extended her invitation with elegance, and for men who often carried the weight of empire, her hospitality felt like relief. The clink of glasses rang out as the first round of mulled wine was poured. The liquid, rich and ruby-colored, steamed in the cold of the room, its surface dancing with fragments of orange peel and sticks of cinnamon. It was more than a drink. It was a tradition, a reminder that even in times of hardship, Christmas brought small pleasures. Each admiral raised his goblet with a smile, toasting to comrades lost, to victories won, and to the promise of the year to come. Their voices boomed and blended, the laughter shaking the rafters. And yet, in the glow of the firelight, there were details too subtle for the untrained eye. Clara's gaze lingered just a fraction too long as she watched each man bring the cup to his lips. Her smile, so practiced and inviting, did not quite reach her eyes. The servants, instructed with unusual precision, moved with rehearsed efficiency, ensuring every goblet was filled, every plate replenished. There was no hint of chaos in the service, only an unnerving order. Outside, the world was drenched in innocence. The voices of carolers floated through the crisp night air, hymns of peace and joy filling the streets. In the distance, church bells tolled, calling the faithful to midnight mass. Horses clattered across the cobbles, carrying townsfolk to celebrations of their own. All of Portsmouth seemed alive with merriment, the harbor glittering with lantern light. But inside Clara Booth's home, death sat quietly at the table. It wore no face, no cloak, no shadow. It hid instead in the sweetness of the wine, in the warmth of the spices, waiting patiently for its moment. The admirals carried on in blissful ignorance, recounting tales of storms weathered, of near misses with enemy ships, of the pride of hoisting their colors in victory. Their laughter swelled with each passing toast, and their bodies leaned heavily into the comfort of the feast. They had no reason to suspect betrayal, no reason to fear the woman who smiled so gently at their stories. To them, Clara Booth was a gracious hostess offering companionship on the holiest of nights. To history, she was preparing their final supper. The night stretched onward, the candles burning low, the fire casting long, sinister shadows on the walls. As goblets were drained and refilled, the clock in the hall ticked inexorably forward, marking time not toward a new dawn, but toward disaster. In the margins of the night, fate had already written the end. And so it begins, this story of betrayal cloaked in celebration, of life extinguished at the very moment it seemed safest. A Christmas toast that would turn into a death sentence. For 6 admirals of the Royal Navy, the banquet at Clara Booth's home was not a celebration but a trap, a carefully staged theater of death that would haunt Portsmouth for centuries to come. Portsmouth in the late 18th century was not merely a coastal town, but the very lifeblood of Britain's naval supremacy. Its docks bristled with towering masts, sails furled tight, and hulls that carried the scars of voyages to the farthest reaches of the world. Shipbuilders, carpenters, and blacksmiths worked tirelessly along the waterfront, their hammers echoing like a heartbeat through the fog. The salty air was thick with tar, smoke, and the endless cries of gulls circling overhead. For every child skipping stones by the shore, there were 10 sailors returning from sea, their bodies worn and their pockets heavy with coin, eager to spend it in the taverns that lined the crooked streets. Portsmouth was a city of contradictions. On one side, a beacon of empire's pride, on the other, a haven of vice and desperation. It was in this world that admirals held almost mythical stature. They were the chosen few, men whose commands could alter the fate of nations. When an admiral walked through the dockyard, even the rowdiest sailor lowered his voice, for these men had endured the storms of the Atlantic, the burning heat of the Caribbean, and the merciless fire of French cannon. They bore medals pinned to their coats and scars hidden beneath their uniforms, reminders of sacrifices made in silence. The people of Portsmouth revered them, and yet feared them too, for admirals were symbols of power, authority, and the empire's ceaseless hunger for victory. Against this backdrop, widows like Clara Booth navigated a precarious existence. A woman left without a husband could easily be swallowed by obscurity, relegated to whispers of pity in drawing rooms or the harsh struggle of making ends meet. Yet Clara was not like other widows. Through charm, wealth, and an undeniable intelligence, she secured herself a place among the naval elite, her home becoming a salon of sorts where men of influence gathered. She understood the delicate balance between admiration and suspicion. A woman of means had to play her role carefully, for society celebrated her hospitality but condemned any sign of ambition. Too much independence, too sharp a wit, and the same voices that praised her generosity would accuse her of cunning. Portsmouth at Christmas time magnified these contrasts. Sailors filled the taverns with drunken songs, their wages spilling into the hands of innkeepers and brothel owners. Churches overflowed with congregants seeking absolution, the hymns rising above the clatter of dice and the shouts of gambling halls. On the high street, merchants displayed exotic goods brought back from voyages, silks from India, tobacco from Virginia, spices from the East Indies. It was a city both blessed by fortune and cursed by vice. And in this liminal space, between sanctity and sin, Clara Booth's Christmas banquet became an event of significance. The admirals who attended her gathering were not merely friends, they were symbols. By accepting her invitation, they elevated her standing, placing her at the center of Portsmouth's social sphere. To be a widow hosting such men was extraordinary, a testament to her ability to command respect in a world that often sought to silence women. But to the men themselves, the banquet was equally alluring. After months at sea or weeks of bureaucratic burdens, here was respite, a warm hall, a fine meal, and the companionship of peers who understood the weight of command. The naval world of Portsmouth was rife with rivalries and politics. Admirals were not immune to jealousy, suspicion, or the quiet maneuverings of influence. To sit together at Clara Booth's table was to briefly lay down the burden of competition, to share laughter instead of strategy. Yet even in the warmth of her dining hall, the specter of empire loomed. Every man present carried with him the unspoken knowledge that the wars never truly ended. France, Spain, America, all were etched into their memories, the oceans forever restless with new threats. Clara's banquet was, in its own way, an act of defiance against this reality, a pause in the relentless march of duty, an oasis of civility in a world of chaos. Still, beneath the finery of Portsmouth society, dangers brewed. Gossip was a weapon sharper than any blade, and reputations could crumble with a whisper. To some, Clara's closeness with the Admirals was a scandal in itself, a woman daring to place herself within the orbit of power usually reserved for men. To others, it was proof of her generosity, a kindness offered to men who had sacrificed everything for king and country. But no one could have suspected that behind her practiced smile lay something more sinister. As Christmas night approached, Portsmouth carried on in its duality. Sailors brawling in the taverns while choirs sang carols in candlelit chapels, children gazing at sugar-dusted pastries in bakery windows, while thieves picked pockets in the alleys. It was a city alive with light and shadow, celebration and secrecy. And it was here, in this complex world of glory and vice, that Clara Booth prepared her table for the men who would unknowingly drink their final toast. Clara Booth's life had never been a straight path, nor had it been entirely dictated by chance. Born into a modest household on the edges of Portsmouth, she learned early the precariousness of survival in a port city. Her father, a clerk with unstable earnings, often returned home with liquor on his breath and debts chasing at his heels. Her mother, weary and hardened by circumstance, taught Clara the importance of appearances, clean clothes even when the larder was empty, a polite smile even when pride was wounded. From this upbringing, Clara absorbed the lesson that survival was never just about what one possessed, but about what one could make others believe. Her marriage to Captain Edmund Booth, a man 20 years her senior, seemed at first to promise stability. He was a naval officer with connections, a figure respected enough to open doors in Portsmouth society. Clara, barely out of girlhood when she wed him, found herself suddenly transported into a world of uniforms, military banquets, and whispered politics at the docks. She learned how to navigate the small cruelties of officers' wives, who measured one another by wealth, lineage, and influence. For years she played the role of dutiful wife, entertaining guests at Edmund's side, pouring tea, nodding silently while men spoke over her. Yet she listened, always listened. In those conversations, she caught glimpses of power, who commanded what fleet, which admiral owed debts, which merchant had bribed his way into favor. These fragments of knowledge were weapons, and Clara learned to wield them. When Edmund died suddenly of fever contracted during a voyage, Clara was left a widow at 30. For most women, such a fate spelled ruin. A widow without children often found herself cast aside, dependent on charity or forced into hasty remarriage. But Clara did not wither. She inherited her husband's modest estate, and with it, his network of acquaintances. She transformed her home into a gathering place, her dinners becoming a magnet for officers, merchants, and politicians. There, she played the perfect hostess, witty but never too sharp, charming but never vulgar, attentive yet never servile. She mastered the art of making men feel important while never revealing just how much she observed in silence. Still, beneath the silk gowns and carefully composed smiles, Clara's situation was more fragile than it appeared. Her finances, though comfortable at first, began to strain under the weight of maintaining her position. Hosting banquets was costly, and Portsmouth society was quick to abandon a hostess who failed to dazzle. Clara knew too well that a widow without wealth or charm became invisible. And invisibility, in a town fueled by gossip and power, was a kind of death. It was during these years of widowhood that Clara's reputation sharpened into something both alluring and dangerous. Admirals and captains flocked to her table, praising her wit and her beauty, yet behind closed doors, rumors spread. Some said she was too clever for her own good, that she manipulated men with her laughter and her wine. Others whispered that she sought more than companionship, that she craved control in a world where women were expected to yield. Each rumor placed her more firmly outside the safe boundaries of what society allowed. To some, she was merely scandalous. To others, she was threatening. And perhaps she was. Whether driven by desperation, bitterness, or a darkness buried deep within her soul, Clara began to look at her guests differently. They were no longer simply men of influence. They were pawns, figures whose downfall might serve her survival or her revenge. Did she resent them for the casual cruelty of their wives, who dismissed her as an ambitious widow? Did she envy their authority, their ability to dictate the fate of ships and men with a single order? Or did she simply tire of playing the smiling hostess, craving instead the power to instill fear? What makes Clara Booth's story so haunting is the uncertainty of her motives. Was it calculated greed, an inheritance here, a debt forgiven there, that drove her to poison? Was it a festering anger at the society that caged her in expectations and punished her independence? Or was it, most chilling of all, the thrill of watching powerful men collapse under her hand, the intoxication of wielding death in a world that denied her every other form of power? Clara's mask never slipped in public. To her guests, she was the widow of refinement, offering solace and companionship in a season of cheer. To her servants, she was demanding but precise, her instructions sharp as a blade. To herself, perhaps, she was more than all of this, a woman determined not to be forgotten, even if it meant etching her name into history with poison. As the night of the banquet drew closer, Clara prepared not only her house, but her performance. Every detail of the evening was chosen with care, the decorations, the menu, the guest list. But the true centerpiece was the mulled wine, spiced and sweet, a drink meant to warm the soul and soften the tongue. To her admirals, it was hospitality. To Clara, it was a weapon. And when they lifted their goblets in cheer, they would unknowingly toast to their own deaths. The night of the banquet arrived with a bitter wind sweeping in from the channel, rattling shutters and carrying with it the sharp scent of salt and smoke from the harbor. Inside Clara Booth's home, however, there was warmth and light. The grand dining hall glowed with the flicker of dozens of candles, their flames trembling in the draught yet illuminating the polished wood, the glitter of crystal and the sheen of silver. Garlands of holly and evergreen hung along the walls, and the hearth roared with a fire that cast shadows dancing across the faces of the gathered guests. Outside, the streets were alive with carolers and drunken sailors. But within these walls, another kind of story unfolded, one that began with laughter and would end in death. Carriages pulled up one after another, and the guests arrived wrapped in heavy cloaks, their uniforms peeking beneath the fur linings. These were no ordinary men. Admirals of the Royal Navy, veterans of decades of war, carried themselves with the pride of men who had commanded ships against storms and enemy fire alike. Their presence alone lent the banquet a sense of grandeur, their laughter booming as they shook snow from their shoulders and handed their hats to the waiting servants. Clara welcomed them one by one, her voice warm, her smile gracious, her hand resting just lightly enough on an arm to make the guest feel both honored and at ease. The table was a marvel of excess. Platters of roasted goose gleamed with golden skin, hams glistened with honey glaze, bowls overflowed with sugared fruits, and pyramids of candied nuts shimmered under the candlelight. The centerpiece, however, was the mulled wine, a deep ruby concoction simmered with oranges, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, and a hint of star anise. The aroma filled the hall, comforting and intoxicating, promising joy in every steaming goblet. The servants, moving with choreographed precision, poured it generously, filling cup after cup until every admiral held a measure of it in hand. At first, the night unfolded as any Christmas gathering might. The men raised their glasses, toasting to the king, to victories at sea, to absent comrades, and to Clara herself, whose hospitality they praised without reserve. Laughter echoed through the room, punctuated by the clatter of knives and forks, the crack of bones being carved, the rustle of silk and lace as servants hurried between chairs. Clara presided at the head of the table, smiling, speaking softly, guiding the rhythm of the evening. No one noticed that her eyes flicked again and again toward the goblets, watching the admirals as they drank deeply. The first signs were subtle. One of the older admirals paused mid-sentence, pressing a hand to his temple as though struck by sudden dizziness. Another coughed into his napkin, dismissing it as the chill air clinging to his lungs. But within moments, unease began to spread. A goblet clattered to the table, spilling red liquid across the linen like a spreading stain of blood. Chairs scraped against the floor as men shifted uncomfortably, clutching their stomachs. The laughter faltered, replaced by uneasy glances, the kind exchanged by men used to danger but unprepared for its source. Panic came swiftly. One admiral rose, his face ashen, only to collapse against the table, his body convulsing. Another staggered backward, his chair crashing to the floor, his hands clawing at his throat as though fighting for air. Servants cried out, dishes crashed to the ground, and the once harmonious hall dissolved into chaos. The sweet scent of mulled wine turned sinister, filling the air like a choking fog. The admirals, men who had braved cannon fire and tempests, fell one by one, undone not by enemy shot, but by the very drink they had toasted with. Clara remained seated, her expression carefully schooled. To the servants, it may have appeared as shock, the frozen stillness of a woman overwhelmed. But to any who looked closer, there was something unreadable in her gaze, a calm detachment, perhaps even satisfaction. She moved slowly, rising only after the worst had begun, her hand steady on the back of her chair. Around her, the room echoed with groans, shouts, and the frantic rustle of panicked men and women, but Clara herself seemed almost outside of it, a figure untouched by the storm she had unleashed. The scene was a grotesque inversion of celebration. Candles toppled, dripping wax like blood onto the tablecloth. Goblets rolled across the floor, their contents staining the polished wood. Admirals who only hours earlier had walked with dignity now lay crumpled on the ground, their faces pale, their breath shallow. Servants fled to the streets, screaming for help, while others knelt beside their masters, weeping and begging them to hold on. Outside, the bells of midnight mass began to toll, their solemn notes clashing with the shrieks from Clara's home. The contrast was unbearable, a city celebrating peace and salvation while, in one house, death claimed the empire's heroes. The poison worked quickly, robbing the men of strength and leaving them helpless in a matter of minutes. By the time physicians were summoned, it was far too late. 6 admirals lay still, their final feast transformed into a macabre tableau. The surviving guests, pale and trembling, could only stare in horror, unable to fathom how a night of cheer had turned so suddenly into tragedy. In that moment, Portsmouth changed forever. The news of the Admirals' collapse would ripple through the city before dawn, spreading whispers of treachery, betrayal, and the unthinkable notion that their deaths had not been fate but design. And at the center of it all stood Clara Booth, her gown unstained, her face composed, a widow whose Christmas hospitality had become a story of horror that no one would forget. The morning after the banquet, Portsmouth awoke to a city trembling with rumor. Word spread faster than the sea winds that swept through the harbor. Admirals, men of near-mythic stature, had died in the home of a widow during a Christmas feast. Sailors whispered it on the docks, merchants passed it from customer to customer, and church bells seemed to toll with an added weight as the town tried to comprehend the enormity of what had happened. 6 men, commanders of Britain's naval pride, lay cold before their time, not struck down by enemy cannon or raging storm, but by poison slipped into a festive cup. Authorities moved quickly, though the very nature of the crime left them groping in the dark. Early forensic science was crude at best. Physicians examined the bodies with little more than instinct, noting the blackened tongues, the twisted expressions, the stomach cramps that spoke of something unnatural. Poison, one doctor muttered, though what poison or how it was delivered remained speculation. The servants were interrogated first, dragged one by one into separate rooms, their accounts shaky with fear. Each claimed ignorance. They had poured wine, carried platters, cleared dishes, but none admitted to tampering. Suspicion, inevitably, turned toward Clara Booth herself. The notion was both shocking and irresistible. A widow, known for her elegance and generosity, accused of orchestrating the deaths of 6 admirals? It seemed unthinkable, and yet, as the details emerged, the possibility grew harder to ignore. Clara had overseen the entire preparation, her word dictating every detail of the feast. The wine, spiced and brewed in her own kitchen, had been served at her instruction. Her composure during the chaos had struck some as admirable, but to others, unsettlingly calm. If she had truly been shocked, why had she not wept, screamed, or fainted as so many ladies might? Why had she remained so poised, her voice steady even as the room descended into horror? Investigators scoured her home, prying into cupboards, examining the remnants of food, sniffing at the dregs left in the goblets. They found traces that burned on the tongue, bitter notes hidden beneath the sweetness of wine. It was no accident. Someone had planned this with chilling precision. Yet the lack of advanced science meant much was left to conjecture. There were no chemical tests, no laboratories, only taste and suspicion. Still, the circumstantial evidence pointed in one direction, and gossip outside the house had already turned conviction into certainty. Clara Booth, the widow who had entertained Admirals, was whispered to be their murderer. Portsmouth society reeled. Some defended her, insisting she had been a victim of circumstance, that perhaps a servant had acted without her knowledge, or that some outside enemy had sought to strike at the Navy through her unsuspecting household. Others were less forgiving, declaring her a temptress who lured powerful men to their deaths. In taverns, sailors swore she had sold her soul to the devil. In parlors, ladies whispered that her ambition had finally revealed its monstrous core. To the authorities, the need for justice was urgent, not only for the deaths themselves, but for the stain they left upon Britain's pride. To admit that 6 admirals had been felled by poison at a dinner table was humiliating enough. To leave the crime unsolved would be unbearable. Clara herself faced questioning with a demeanor that baffled even her interrogators. She did not plead hysterically nor collapse in despair. Instead, she answered calmly, denying any wrongdoing, insisting she had only wished to provide cheer in a season of loneliness. Her words were measured, her tone composed, yet her serenity only deepened suspicion. It was as though she inhabited a world apart, untouched by grief or fear. Some saw in her composure the mark of guilt. Others, the strength of innocence maligned. As the days passed, the investigation became not just a pursuit of facts, but a spectacle. Crowds gathered outside her home, gawking at the windows, straining for glimpses of the woman whose name now hung on every tongue. Pamphlets appeared in the streets, printed hastily with lurid headlines: "Widow's Feast ends in slaughter," and "6 admirals poisoned in Portsmouth." The people craved answers, and in the absence of clarity, rumor became truth. Officials debated in secret chambers how to proceed. Some argued for swift trial and punishment, fearing unrest if justice was delayed. Others hesitated, aware that to convict without proof risked turning Clara into a martyr of circumstance. The Navy itself pressed for resolution. The death of 6 admirals was not a private matter, but a national humiliation. Whispers spread that foreign agents might have been involved, that France or Spain had somehow reached into Portsmouth's heart. But even these theories circled back to Clara. If she was not the mastermind, then at the very least, she was the vessel through which the poison had been delivered. The contrast between public image and private suspicion grew unbearable. Once hailed as a gracious hostess, Clara now found herself the object of jeers and curses as she was escorted under guard through the streets. Where once men tipped their hats, now they spat. Where women once admired her gowns, now they crossed themselves at the sight of her. Portsmouth had made up its mind. The widow was guilty, whether or not the courts had spoken. What the investigation revealed most starkly was not the science of crime, but the psychology of a city unwilling to face uncertainty. In a world without modern forensics, guilt was shaped not by evidence alone, but by perception, rumor, and the need for closure. And in Clara Booth's case, the perception was damning. 6 admirals lay buried, their coffins draped in the flags of empire, while the widow who had presided over their final feast stood at the center of a storm that threatened to consume her. The trial of Clara Booth opened beneath a gray English sky, with the streets of Portsmouth swollen by crowds eager to witness history in the making. Trials in the 18th century were as much theater as justice, and this one promised a spectacle unlike any other. Carriages clogged the narrow lanes, bearing officers, dignitaries, and curious citizens, all craning for a glimpse of the widow accused of poisoning 6 admirals with mulled wine. Inside the courthouse, the air was heavy with anticipation, the scent of damp wool cloaks mingling with ink and candle smoke. Every eye turned when Clara entered, her figure poised, her face calm, as though she were not a woman on trial for her life, but a guest at yet another gathering. The prosecution wasted no time in painting her as a black widow, a temptress who had lured powerful men into her home only to deliver them to their graves. They spoke of her banquets, her charm, her uncanny ability to gather admirals beneath her roof. They recounted the Christmas feast in excruciating detail, describing the steaming goblets, the sudden sickness, the chaos that followed. What else could it be, they argued, but deliberate murder? And who else could have arranged it but the woman who controlled every element of the evening? Their words dripped with outrage, tapping into the public's hunger for a villain. Clara's defense, in contrast, sought to unravel certainty. Her lawyer argued that no direct evidence tied her hand to the poison. Could not a servant, bribed or careless, have been responsible? Could not an enemy of the Admirals, foreign or domestic, have slipped into the preparations unnoticed? He reminded the jury that poison leaves few traces, and in a household bustling with activity, suspicion alone was not proof. His voice rose in defense of her character, portraying her as a lonely widow who sought only to host men of standing in an effort to remain visible in a society that cast widows aside. Yet even as he spoke, whispers filled the hall. The public had already judged, and reason struggled against rumor. Witnesses paraded before the court. Servants testified to Clara's control over the banquet, her precise instructions for the preparation of wine and food. Some swore she alone had ordered the spices for the mulled wine, selecting each with a meticulousness that seemed, in hindsight, sinister. Surviving guests recalled her calm demeanor as the Admirals collapsed, her refusal to panic even as death swept the room. What had seemed poise on the night now appeared cold detachment. Every word, every memory, was twisted into evidence. The widow's mask became, in the courtroom's imagination, the mask of a killer. Clara herself was called to speak, and the silence that fell as she took the stand was profound. She did not tremble, nor did she raise her voice. She denied all charges, insisting she had loved and respected her guests, that she had never wished them harm. She spoke of her grief at their passing, her confusion at the accusations hurled against her. "I am guilty only of hospitality," she declared, her eyes fixed on the jurors. Some felt the weight of her words, but to others, her composure was the most damning evidence of all. A woman truly innocent, they reasoned, would have broken under such pressure. The press seized on every moment. Pamphlets were printed overnight, each more lurid than the last. The poisoned banquet, the widow's treachery, a temptress on trial. Artists sketched her likeness with darkened eyes, selling portraits that showed her as both villain and seductress. The people devoured these tales, their fascination tinged with fear. To them, Clara was not just one woman. She was a symbol of what could happen when ambition, intelligence, and secrecy converged in a society that sought to restrain women. The trial became a moral battleground. Clergymen denounced her as a Jezebel, a woman who had stepped beyond her proper role and was punished by divine justice. Others whispered that she was being scapegoated, her independence twisted into guilt because the authorities could not admit their helplessness in the face of poison. In the tension of the courtroom, the boundaries blurred between truth and narrative, evidence and performance. Day after day, the arguments circled like vultures. The prosecution thundered about betrayal, about 6 coffins draped in naval flags, about a nation humiliated by the treachery within its own harbor. The defense countered with reason, pointing to the absence of proof, to the fragility of relying on memory and rumor. But reason faltered against outrage. To let Clara go free would have been to admit failure, to leave the deaths unexplained. To convict her was to offer closure, however tenuous. As the final arguments closed, the jury withdrew, leaving the court hushed with expectation. Hours passed, the air thick with suspense. When they returned, their verdict was delivered with solemnity, guilty. A cry rippled through the chamber, part triumph, part sorrow, part satisfaction that justice, or at least the semblance of it, had been done. Clara Booth, the widow whose Christmas banquet had ended in death, was condemned not just by law but by the weight of public opinion. She heard the verdict with the same calm that had marked her every appearance. No tears fell, no pleas escaped her lips. She merely bowed her head slightly, as though acknowledging the inevitable. Whether that composure was the mask of innocence or the defiance of guilt remains a question that history cannot resolve. What is certain is that the trial etched her name into infamy, a story retold in whispers, sermons, and ballads. The tale of the temptress widow who turned Christmas wine into death. In the years that followed, the story of Clara Booth and her Christmas banquet refused to fade. Portsmouth, a town already steeped in legends of naval triumphs and tragedies, found in her tale a darker chapter, one whispered in taverns and murmured in candlelit parlors long after the trial had ended. The deaths of 6 admirals were not merely personal losses, but symbolic wounds to the empire itself. These were men who had faced storms on the Atlantic and cannon fire from French decks, only to fall in the safety of a dining hall, undone by a goblet of wine. The irony was too sharp, too grotesque to be forgotten. In time, the facts of the case blurred, replaced by rumor, embellishment, and outright invention. Some swore Clara had confessed at the gallows, whispering of hidden motives and long-nurtured grudges. Others claimed she had died protesting her innocence, a martyr to a society eager to find a villain. Still others spun the tale into myth, suggesting she had learned the secrets of poisons from apothecaries or from sailors who brought strange powders from the East. Whether she was a calculating murderer or a scapegoat of circumstance, Clara's name became entwined with poison, with treachery, with the shadows that haunt the season of light. For Portsmouth itself, the banquet left an indelible scar. The town that had celebrated Christmas with song and lanterns now carried the memory of carols interrupted by screams, of bells tolling as admirals gasped their final breaths. Each December, as mulled wine simmered in kitchens and taverns, some could not help but glance into their cups with unease, remembering that sweetness can cloak danger, that warmth can conceal betrayal. The drink that had once symbolized cheer became, for many, a reminder of death's quiet patience. The legacy of Clara Booth extended beyond Portsmouth. Pamphlets and broadsides carried her story across England, transforming her into a figure of fascination and dread. Playwrights adapted her tale into crude dramas, moralists used her as a warning against female ambition, and ballads carried her name into villages far from the sea. In these retellings, she was cast in many roles: the seductress, the avenger, the monster, the misunderstood woman crushed by a world that mistrusted her independence. Each version said less about Clara herself and more about the fears and desires of the people who repeated them. Historians, years later, would wrestle with the evidence, questioning whether justice had truly been served. With no clear proof of her hand on the poison, could the verdict have been shaped more by public outrage than fact? In an age when women were expected to remain silent and submissive, was Clara punished not only for suspected murder, but for daring to exist as a woman of influence? The truth may never be known. What remains is the enduring fascination with her story, the way it continues to straddle the line between fact and legend. Perhaps that is the most haunting legacy of all, that Clara Booth became less a person and more a symbol. She embodied the fear that evil can lurk behind a gracious smile, that trust can be shattered at the very moment it seems strongest. She reminded a society drunk on its own pride that power does not only rest in cannons or fleets, but can also be wielded silently, invisibly, in a sip of wine. As the years turned into decades, Portsmouth moved on, its docks filled with new ships, its taverns with new songs. Yet every Christmas, the shadows of that banquet lingered. Beneath the hymns of joy and the glow of candles, there remained the memory of a night when celebration turned to catastrophe. Clara Booth's story became a cautionary tale, a ghost that haunted the season, reminding all who heard it that darkness is never far from light. And so the tale endures: a widow, a banquet, 6 admirals, and a cup of mulled wine. A story where festivity masked betrayal, where honor met treachery, and where Christmas cheer was forever stained by death. To this day, it whispers from the edges of history, a reminder that the brightest nights can harbor the deepest shadows, and that trust, once broken, can echo across centuries.